So it is Wednesday, May 11th, and so this presentation is on funerals with Forethought. So for those folks watching on Zoom, there is an outline that I'm sharing on the screen, and then for those folks here, there are some handouts in the fellowship hall, and then after this, Pastor Dennis will send out the recording of the session, and I'll also send out a electronic copy of the outline and of various handouts. Oh, seriously? Yeah, but yeah. Okay. Now, can you still see okay. Can you see my funerals of Forethought? I keep asking.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day, for your presence with us. And we pray that you would be with us in our conversations here, that we would be able to learn more about planning our end-of-life ritual and helping our loved ones do the same, that they would be meaningful celebrations and offer hope and inspiration to us all. In your son's name we pray, amen. And also, Pat and Bruce McCaskill are here, and they did let me know prior to the session starting that their 46-year-old son has tragically and unexpectedly passed away on Monday in Lethbridge. So keep them in your prayers, and we'll put that on our announcement sheet. But we recognize when we discuss things like this that we can get triggered by things. So we hold each and every person with compassion this day, particularly Bruce and Pat. All right, so I have no idea. I'm going to keep it under an hour, which means I'm going to quickly skim through a lot of the beginning things just to give us some background. So I'm going to start briefly talking about the purpose of funerals and end-of-life rituals. So we live in and welcome Brenda. We live in a death-defying culture where we don't like to think about death, but yet we're all familiar with that old adage that says there are two things in life that are certain: death and taxes. And I have certainly seen a shift in my time at Christ Lutheran, fewer church funerals, more graveside services. And, you know, I'm not making any judgment on that. I think for some people, the graveside service is more appropriate than a church funeral. And my dad is a perfect example of that. He didn't go to church for many, many years. And for him to have a graveside service, he loved the outdoors and he wasn't into music. So there was, no need to have singing. And plus none of us are singers on that side of the family. So it was very true to who he was. So it's not about choosing a traditional church funeral or it's more about what honors the life of your loved one and what is true to them. And the important thing is to have something for ourselves or for our loved ones. So I have seen a cultural shift to simpler services, which is perfectly fine. Sometimes those who pass away have expressed to loved ones what they would like for an end-of-life ritual, whether it be a funeral or graveside service or something else or nothing at all. But of course, I will encourage something and then I'll go on to why. Okay, well, I'll go on to that next. And also the recognition that these end-of-life services, as I said previously, are more for the living than they are for the one who passed away. But of course, we want to honor the wishes of those who have passed away. So the end-of-life rituals serve several important purposes. So end-of-life rituals help us acknowledge that someone we love has died. They allow us to say goodbye, which is very important. And they also offer continuity and hope for the living. And they also provide a support system for us, friends, family members, and community. And they also allow us to reflect on the meaning of life and death. So keeping these important purposes in mind, we likely realize, like I said, those end-of-life rituals are more for the living than they are for those who passed away. And also, even though this is geared around also, obviously people passing away, it's also important to acknowledge the passing of our pets. And that's one of those losses that isn't socially recognized. My son had two rats, and one passed away about a week ago, and we kept him in a Ziploc bag in the freezer, and we just buried him in our backyard yesterday. And but we had, like, I just had a brief service for Nathan the rat, and previous to that was Brendan the rat. And I'm on call to offer those end of life rituals for your pets as well, so that you can see that that's possible to grieve in that way. And Connor's comment was, "I'm so glad that I have a mom who's a pastor." Anyway. Now, so in terms of end of life rituals, just admitting someone. Okay, so in terms of end of life rituals, so I had heard someone talk about two experiences they had with losing a loved one. In one instance, the family followed the request of their loved one to not have a service of any kind. And in another case, the family chose to have a service, despite the fact that their loved one had expressed that they didn't want a service. The family who chose to respect the wishes of their loved one to not have a service struggled with their grief. The family who chose to have a service, even though it was against the wishes of their loved one, found it immensely helpful in facilitating that grief process. So again, weighing the wishes of your loved ones and the needs of the living. And then, of course, as we plan our own services, it just makes things all the more clear for our loved ones that we leave behind. And likewise, a funeral home employee who also functions as a grief counselor will tell you that the families who choose not to have a service for their loved ones are the ones that struggle more with the reality of death and the grief process. All right, so next is the hierarchy of the purpose of a funeral service. So point number 2 on the outline. Funerals have been with us since the beginning of human history because they help us move from life before death to life after death. And the hierarchy of, and then I'm going to go through each of these a little bit, the hierarchy of reality, recall, support, expression, meaning, and transcendence describes how an end-of-life ritual can help us begin the healing process. So in terms of reality, an end-of-life ritual can help us begin to truly acknowledge the reality that someone in our life has passed away. In terms of recall, an end-of-life service can encourage us to remember the person who died and to share unique memories with others, creating hope for the future. So in terms of support, an end-of-life ritual can help bring together people who care about each other in an atmosphere of love and support. And of course, we know COVID changed that a lot in the times that we were restricted to attendance to smaller numbers and such, which means grief is much more complicated when that support isn't freely available. And the fourth point is expression. And then I will have this information outlined in more detail in a handout. So an end-of-life ritual can allow us to express our inner thoughts and feelings about the life and death of the person as well. So it gives us that permission to express those things. And I found I wrote and read my dad's eulogy, and I found it very healing to be able to reflect on that and put those things on paper. And I kind of was able to tie things together in a way that if I hadn't written the eulogy, I don't know if I'd been able to tie those together. So for instance, so I think most of you know my dad chose medically assisted death. And so he, the last week of his life, he was in a hospital bed in my sister's living room in Calgary, where me and my siblings and my nieces and nephews could gather around him. And then when the nurse and the doctor were there starting the procedure, my nephew was playing like soft music, and the Frank Sinatra song, "I Did It My Way," came on. And we're all looking at each other, and we actually kind of laughed, right? Because how ironic is this? And I just saw it, I experienced it as a God moment. And then I tied that into the eulogy. That's the way my dad lived his life. He did it his way. He didn't always make choices that, sometimes I wished he would have made other choices, but he lived his life his way. All right, so the next hierarchy of purpose in a funeral service is meaning. So an end-of-life ritual can mark the significance of the life that was lived. So you reflect on the gifts that you received from this person and how they inspired you. And they also help us find meaning and purpose in our continued living, even in the face of loss. And then the final hierarchy of purpose of an end-of-life ritual is transcendence. So an end-of-life ritual can help us embrace the wonder of life and death. Okay, and then so the next thing, okay, so now I recently discovered, I'm going to go on to point 3, what does it mean to get closure after death? Someone recently mentioned to me that they don't like the word closure, and I was interested in that. And their understanding of closure was it meant that you sort of close the door on your loved one and their memories, but that's not actually what it means. So on the handout, I have closure is the term used to describe the process of acceptance after the death of a loved one. And this isn't a one-time thing, but it's a process, right? Because we know that grief is a process. So closure looks a lot like the final stage of grief. Closure doesn't mean that you've completely forgotten about your loved one, but it does mean that you have returned to a new normal way of life. So I wanted to intentionally talk about that word closure. All right, so now we're on point 4, the elements of a meaningful service. And this information comes from a grief guru who Brenda is quite familiar with, named Dr. Alan Wolfelt. So any resources or information from this person, will be exceptional. So Dr. Wolfelt is an author, educator, and grief counselor. And he suggests that the elements of a meaningful service are, and I have them on the handout. So actions, and I'll just read them all and then just talk briefly about them. So actions, gathering, symbols, eulogy and remembrance, visitation and reception, music, and readings. So in terms of actions, some beautiful actions that I've seen in end-of-life rituals are, and one of them was just recently, a common one is laying flowers or roses. And often it's at the graveside on the casket or maybe in the hole with the urn. And then recently a family, as they came into the church, each family member placed a rose of a different color on the memory table at the front of the church. And I thought that was beautiful to start the service that way. And to me, this ties into symbolism. The symbolism of that was it also visually showed the growing beauty and color of the legacy of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that this person left. So it was just such a beautiful way to start the service. And for my dad, we put wheat. We laid wheat because his background was farming. Like, well, his background kind of up to his 40s was farming. And other things I've seen, there's a funeral I did, and the family and the loved one really loved Hawaii. So they came dressed in Hawaiian clothes and leis. And other times families choose to dress in the favorite color of the loved one. So those are different ways that you can add extra meaning to the service. And also in terms of another thing I've seen is one family, when they were bringing the urn to the graveside, they passed it on from the children of the loved one that passed away. So the daughter passed it on to the son passed it on to the other son, and I think it was the oldest son that laid it on the graveside. And that was just before my dad passed away, and I was very inspired by that. So for my dad's graveside service, we wanted to visualize the growing legacy that he left in us 4 kids and the 6 grandchildren. So, and there was no funeral home present for my dad's service because I guess I knew enough that I knew that we didn't need that. It was a simple service. So we carried the urn from my sister's vehicle to the graveside. So the 10 of us were equidistantly spaced between the graveside and the vehicle. And we started with my brother and his wife, because my brother's the oldest, and we like to call him the golden boy. And then, so he passed it on to, the next sibling, my sister Lana, and then my sister Lisa, and then me. So then we just gathered, this crowd gathered. So anyway, it was like we experienced it as a beautiful visual and way of honoring my dad and his legacy. So those are some meaningful rituals and actions you can think about. So the next one, gathering. So again, that is in terms of, whether we have a funeral in the church or whether we have a gathering at a graveside service. And even in the winter, a family had wanted a graveside service in the winter, and they had went with Spears, and Spears has a little chapel. So not every funeral home has a chapel, or a little family room. So we had the little service in the family room. So it would be what we would typically do at a graveside, but it was inside a building. So just so you know, there's those options too. Like you don't have to have the graveside service in the freezing cold outside, but you can have something little in a building, or we could even do it here, something more informal. So those are possibilities. So number 3 is symbols. And again, at the end of life ceremony, it's nice to have symbols of what were meaningful to this person. So you often see that on the memory table in front of the church or the chapel when someone's passed away. Again, with my dad, because it was a graveside service, I thought, well, I didn't want to get like a big expensive bouquet of flowers at a flower store, because one, my dad was super cheap, and it would just be too fancy. But my dad loved flowers and flower pots. So I just got a $25 flower pot from Home Depot, and we had that at his graveside. And he had a John Deere license plate, like a fake license plate, said "Born to Farm." So I had that out, and then a picture of him. And again, I'd never seen pictures at graveside services, but one I went to, or when I officiated at just before my dad passed away, had a photo at the graveside. And I thought, well, how nice is that? So we did that for my dad too. So it was just nice to have those symbols to center ourselves around the graveside. And then, so another element of a meaningful service is the eulogy and remembrance, and to share those memories. and visitation and reception. And again, this was very limited during COVID. So people are doing that after the fact now that we're more able to freely gather, but it just gives people that opportunity to connect and share memories. And music, if like music was not meaningful to my dad, he had 2 CDs in his entire apartment when I cleaned out his apartment, Johnny Cash and something else. And, but music is very meaningful to most people. And so to choose music for your service or your loved one's service that are favorites of theirs is very important and meaningful. And then readings, they can be from the Bible, but they don't have to exclusively be from the Bible. So there's other inspirational readings that might be important to people as well. All right, so now we are going to go on to the importance of funeral ceremony. Already touched on a bit. So rituals are symbolic experiences that help us, together with our families and friends, express our deepest thoughts and feelings about life's most important events. So what do all rituals have in common? Rituals unite us. So I'll just name all these and then I'll talk more in depth. So rituals unite us. Rituals help us feel at ease, and rituals help us express our feelings. So rituals unite us. So typically public events, families, friends, church members, villages, even nations create and enact rituals. It's a way of providing a support system for common beliefs and values. Rituals help us feel at ease. Most rituals follow an established specific procedure. The details might change, but the general pattern remains recognizable. And the predictability of rituals helps participants feel at ease as well. And rituals also help us express our feelings. So the symbol of ritual provides a means to express our beliefs and feelings when language alone will not do those beliefs and feelings justice. And like all rituals, an end-of-life ritual is often a public, traditional, and symbolic means of expressing our beliefs, thoughts, and feelings about the death of someone we loved. And then a few quotes that I have come across that express the meaning of rituals. These 2 quotes are both from fictional novels that I read. I guess one might be kind of based on life story, but I just thought it beautifully described the importance of ritual. So this first one is from a book by Gail Bowen, who's a local Regina author, and the title is called Kaleidoscope. And she says, "There is something comforting about a funeral service that follows ritual. A ceremony acknowledging the brokenness that comes in the wake of a death is a reminder that others have faced the abyss and endured." Leland's service adhered to the traditional Protestant pattern of comforting words from the Gospels and Psalms and prayers interspersed with music. When Declan and Margot expressed their personal loss, their pain was searing, and I was grateful that we had the safety net of ritual. So I love that description of the safety net of ritual. So this other quote comes from a book called Eat, Pray, and Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. And she says, "This is what rituals are for. We do spiritual ceremonies as human beings in order to create a safe resting place for our most complicated feelings of joy or trauma, so that we don't have to haul those feelings around with us forever, weighing us down." I love that image, hauling those feelings around and weighing us down. And she goes on to say, "We all need such places of ritual safekeeping, and I do believe that if your culture or tradition doesn't have the specific ritual you're craving, then you are absolutely permitted to make up a ceremony of your own devising, fixing your own broken down emotional systems with all the do-it-yourself resourcefulness of a generous friend. If you bring the right earnestness to your homemade ceremony, God will provide the grace. And that is why we need God. So I also like how she gives us permission to create our own rituals. Yes, so that's a quote from the book Eat, Pray, and Love by Elizabeth Gilbert. All right, so now I'm going to move on to, so I'm on number 7, a 4-step plan. And so I'm just going to quickly read what this 4-step plan is. So, and this information I found, I mostly looked on the Regina Funeral Home website, and this information from Arbor Memorial came from them, and also the Spears Funeral Home website were the two. And I also looked at alternatives for something as well. And I'll talk about funeral homes right at the end. But I might stop the recording for that because I feel it's a bit of a conflict, I think, to express my interactions with funeral homes. But let's see. Okay, so a 4-step plan. So 1, consider your needs. 2, compile your information. 3, create your unique plan. And 4, complete financial details. And some of this is more kind of legal stuff, which is kind of beyond my purview, but just to let you know this information is out there to consider. So in terms of number 1, considering your needs, learn about cremation and burial for an informed decision, and that's part of what we're doing here. And I'm also giving you resources to look into more of that on your own. And then another thing is take into account any requirements of faith and budget. So like at first, and funerals don't have to be expensive. My dad's was like super, super cheap, well, his graveside service. And in terms of faith, again, you know, so do you folks want a traditional funeral in the church, or is a graveside service fine? One of our members passed away, and the family, we didn't have connections with the family. And then the person wasn't able to communicate their wishes the last several years of their life. And the funeral was held at a funeral home, and the family didn't contact the church. We found out through another way. And I attended the service, but I was super sad that it didn't happen in our building, because I knew that would have been the wishes of the person who passed away, because when she was able to, she never missed a Sunday. So for that reason, or that's one of the many reasons why it's important to think about your own plans or have those discussions with your loved ones. So number 2, compile your information. So gather your personal information, account numbers, location of important documents, contacts, etc., and record this information all together in one place. Number 3, create your unique plan. So discover traditional and modern options available to suit taste, culture, and budget. Talk it over with family and a planning specialist if you wish to, and make plans to reflect how you want to be remembered. And then number 4, complete financial details. So let's talk about paying for these things. So 2 things that are important to remember. Funeral bills are due right after the services are complete, but insurance money is often not available until weeks or months down the road. So we can't depend on the fact that our life insurance will pay for the funeral expenses when we pass away. And I know, like, with my dad, I think one of my sisters had power of attorney on his account. So there was access to his bank account. And then there's also different cash that was coming in because I was selling dad's stuff. So we had financial resources to work with. And then all of us kids are trying to talk to my mom to kind of, so that she can make decisions that will make things easier for us. And she's listening to a certain degree, but not completely, but we can only do what we can. But with my dad, it was super handy that he'd already purchased his plot and his gravestone. And then when he passed away and he left the paperwork for us, my sister had the original paperwork and had photocopies, probably 3 different places in his apartment. So when I went to call the funeral home, I just had the certificate number. They called it up and it was like easy as pie. And he'd also pre-planned cremation. He lived north of Strathmore for quite a while, and he made those plans. He prepaid like for cremation and the basics through the funeral home in Strathmore. And again, there's a certificate number, but then he passed away in Calgary. And I know I wanted to work with alternatives, and there was one in Airdrie, just north of Calgary. So again, I had the certificate number. I called up the funeral home in Airdrie, gave them the alternatives in Airdrie, gave them the certificate number, and the information was there. And it couldn't have been simpler for us. So that was very helpful. And then if you choose to prepay, if any amount is not spent, that is returned to the estate. So it's not like the estate is out that money. So that's helpful to know too. And another tip is that your legal will is not a reliable place to record your funeral and cemetery wishes, because the will may not be read until after the service. So to be aware of that as well. So the next thing I'm going to do is, it's 10:34. Yeah, okay. So some planning ahead, frequently asked questions. And again, on this handout, I have the website address. So I'm going to quickly go over some of this information. So why should I pre-plan my final arrangements? It reduces stress for your loved ones. My wishes are outlined in my will, so why would I need to pre-arrange? Your will may not be read until after your end-of-life ritual. Can I prepay only the cemetery plot? Yes, that my dad purchased his plot in Swift Current. He prepaid that separate from his cremation stuff. And then through the course of having these conversations with my mom, we have found out, we do know that my mom also wants to be buried in Swift Current, even though she lives in Calgary. She wants to be cremated. So we found out that, I think my mom found out in the cemetery in Swift Current, up to 2 or 3 urns can be placed with a coffin. So my mom has let us know that she would like to be buried with her grandmother. So at least we know that much for my mom's, what her wishes are. But just so you know that if you choose to be buried in the cemetery, you don't have to purchase a new plot necessarily. And then there's a question, what happens if I move? So again, the story with my dad, he lived north of Strathmore. He made some pre-planned arrangements with the funeral home in Strathmore, but because we had that certificate number, we were able to work with any funeral home that we wished to. All right, so the next thing I'm moving on to is cremation. So we will skim through that. So that's number 9. So again, for cremation, so You could choose to be buried in a cemetery. You could choose your own plot. You could choose to be buried with a family member. Of course, you need to check that out with the cemetery. If you choose cremation in terms of urns, you don't have to buy the urns that the funeral home offers you. Often they're fairly expensive. So for example, if you recall when Pastor Bob passed away, he actually asked a member, because he knew that his time was limited, he asked a member of the congregation to make him an urn out of the white oak of the pews, because there was some stuff left over. So you can ask someone to make an urn. There was someone I officiated at her service, and the daughter said, "Oh, you probably saw the receptacle that my mom is going to be buried in," because she had it. It wasn't an urn exactly, but she saw this beautiful container, thought it would make a nice urn, asked her daughters what they thought of it. And so she bought it, and then it was displayed in her living room until she passed away. So I don't know where she bought it, but just so you know, you don't have to buy an expensive urn from a funeral home. Now, when my father-in-law passed away, there was virtually no money. He had gambling addictions, so there's just no money. And the funeral home said, you don't have to buy an expensive urn. Garth liked fishing, so my husband went to Canadian Tire and bought a $25 tackle box, and Garth's ashes were buried in a $25 tackle box, fishing tackle box from Canadian Tire. So there's those. And what I discovered is you can get urns on Amazon. Not that I encouraging you to give Amazon more money than they already have. But again, you're not limited to the expensive urns. And we did choose an urn for my dad from the funeral home just because it was easy. And here's my dad in my pocket. So we got a little miniature urn. 3 of the 4 of us kids wanted these. And then, so this is what my dad's urn looked like. And I realize now I actually don't need the ashes of my dad with me, but I do like this as a little keepsake to remind me of the urn he was. And man, it's heavy, really heavy. But anyway, and these are an option as well. And again, we looked at Amazon, but it was just easier to get something from the funeral home. And also in terms of cremation, another thing that we did was the funeral home either dropped off the ashes at my sister's house or she picked them up, and then they filled these for the 3 of us kids that wanted them. And then I told my sister Lana that I wanted some of my dad's ashes because we planted a tree in our front yard in his memory, and we wanted to scatter some ashes around the tree. So we did that. So there's some ashes that we buried around my dad's tree. You can pull back some ashes for things like that. Cremation is typically performed right away. My dad was cremated a week after he passed away just because my sister was late on the paperwork. Family members are able to be there for the cremation if they wish to. In my dad's case, we chose not to because we felt we just had a lot of quality time with him before he passed away. Sometimes in terms of spouses, one spouse might prefer a casket, another spouse might prefer an cremation and an urn, and just so you know, you can still be buried together because the urn can still be buried with a casket. And recently I buried someone, and the first spouse that passed away chose to be cremated, and then the second spouse chose the casket. And I believe they placed the urn in the casket before the burial so that they could be together that way. So that was a neat thing that they chose to do. All right, so I believe so. Yeah. Well, and I think, like I just, yeah, in some, like I think in my dad's case, because we were there in the funeral home, when the funeral home picked him up, and then we just trust that they're going to keep a record of him, right? Like that this is who he is. So we didn't have to be there before they cremated him, because identification happened when they picked him up. Sorry? Oh, okay. 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 Thank you for that. Right. Yes. Yes. Right. Okay. Thanks, Brenda. She's more of a guru on this subject than I. Yes. Yes. So somebody asked if you need to identify the body before it's cremated, and Brenda was saying that there are other ways to do that. So, and someone else is nodding there. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is cemetery fee schedule and scattered garden. So I'm not going to go over this information in detail, but what I did want you to be aware of is, because this is a new learning for me, so I do have a handout that I got from the City of Regina website, 2022 cemetery fee schedule. And so Riverside Memorial Park is a City of Regina cemetery. The one at the east end of the city, I just recently discovered that cemetery is owned by Regina Funeral Home. I think that's, so they would have perhaps a different fee schedule. So just so you're aware of that. And a lot of this information, and then if you wanted to know what the fees would be for that cemetery, I believe that would be on the Regina Funeral Home website. And after a loved one passes away, you don't want to be doing the comparison shopping, because you just want to take the easiest path, right? So it's better to do this when you're in a good space. So anyway, I wanted you to know that you can access this information online, and then there's hard copies here, and I'll send electronic copies out to you folks watching via Zoom. And what I wanted to mention was, because this is a new learning for me, is that there's a scattering garden actually at both cemeteries. And I'll officiate at my first service where someone will be released in the scattering garden at Riverside in July. So so I'm just going to read what's on the website here. There is a scattering garden at both Riverside Memorial Park Cemetery and Regina Cemetery. Scattering garden is a peaceful area where you can choose to scatter the ashes of your loved ones upon it, allowing those who have passed away to remain a part of nature in a beautiful setting. A bronze plaque can be purchased to memorialize a loved one. Interments in the scattering gardens are permitted between May and October. So I wanted you all to be aware of that. Okay. Oh, and then in terms of ashes, for some folks, it's an important part of the grieving process to have a place to visit. For other folks, that's not as important. So if you're making plans for your end of life, it's important to have those conversations with your loved ones. So an example was, it had never occurred to me to visit any of my grandparents' graves. I didn't know them very well. And then they're all buried in Swift Current. And then one time I was with my brother and we were traveling to Swift Current. And when I go to Swift Current, I'm visiting my aunts and uncles and, whoever's alive. And then I discovered when my brother goes to Swift Current, he wants to visit the graves and he wants to visit the places that he's familiar with. So for him, it's more about the memories than the relationships with the living. Like that's just, he's a different person. So, so for my brother, a grave would be important to visit. For me, not so much. So if your wish is to scatter your ashes, then you might want to consider something else if your loved ones, if it's important for them to have a place to visit. So just to keep that in mind. Okay, so the next thing I was going to cover is these 87 decisions. And this is a handout, again, that I found on the Regina Funeral Home website through Arbor Memorial. And this is just so that you are aware of all the details that need to be tended to and the potential you have to tend to as many of these as possible before you pass away, or have conversations with your loved ones about these details. So we're not going to go over that in detail, but just as a resource. All right, so point 12, preparing for arrangements. So I found this on the Spears Funeral Home website, and I could not print off a very good copy, but what was helpful about this handout is it makes you aware of details to think about. So vital statistics, for example, like healthcare number, executor information, and then there is information about planning the service in terms of, pallbearers or cremation or casket or whatnot, and then readings and funerals. Oh, memorial donations is one of the things too. You can think about many people want to offer like a charity or something for people to donate to in their memory. And my siblings and I were having a couple email conversations about this in terms of my dad, because he didn't make these specifications. And then at the bottom of that sheet on Spears' website, it talks about the obituary. Obituaries that are in the paper, they charge you by inch, is what I discovered. So, but we want to honor our loved one's memory. So what we did with my dad is we just had very basic information for the newspaper, and we had the longer obituary that said everything we wanted to say on the website of the funeral home, which doesn't cost anything. So because my dad is buried in the cemetery in Swift Current, it was one of the funeral homes there that had my dad's obituary. So just so you know, you can still, because I think some people just have a short obituary because they don't want to pay the extra cost in the paper, which is just good stewardship as far as I'm concerned. But just so you know that there's that long option on the website that won't cost you anything else. Okay, now, so 13 is a Christ Lutheran Church funeral planning sheet. So this is more specifically like I've covered information about funeral planning or planning for an end of life ritual. So this funeral planning sheet that I created and Pastor Dennis nicely formatted it for me. And again, this will go out an electronic copy, and we'll have hard copies at the church available. So these are things to think about for you folks. And if you wanted to fill this out and then give this information to us, we have space in our vault where we're keeping this information so that when you pass away, that information will be there for whoever is here officiating at your service. And one of the reasons we did this was because we found out after Pastor Bob died that somebody had given him their funeral arrangements because they wanted him to do their funeral. But of course, he passed away. And then this person was saying, do you have this information in the office? And we didn't. So now we're setting up a central area to have this information based on what your wishes are. And you'll notice that this is just pertaining to the service because as pastors, that's what we're planning. The other information in terms of, cremation or burial or where you want to be buried, those sorts of things, those are sort of, beyond our scope, obviously, as pastors. So then this handout talks about, where you would like a service or end of life ritual. And of course, the possibilities at the church or a graveside, or perhaps maybe another church, or maybe another location. So music, we typically suggest to families to choose 3 songs or hymns. And I always find it interesting that in some cases, there's an assumption that church hymns must be chosen. That is not the case here at Christ Lutheran. If there are contemporary songs that you want or your loved one wants, that's fine with us. So that's a perfectly legitimate option as well. Some people want a musician, some people want recorded music. Those are other options. And then another thing to think about is if you want special music, some people, have a special hymn or song they want sung, and a specific person they would like to sing that. And then you can think about who you might want to share your eulogy, the remembrance of your life. And then, so point 4 on this handout, you might want to think about Bible readings. If you have a favorite Bible reading, if you can't think of one off the top of your head, you can always, like in church, you might hear something and think, oh, I would love to have that at my service. So you can jot that down and let us know. Or if there are certain topics, you can even Google that in terms of looking for scripture readings, that have to do with hope or comfort or peace, and different possibilities will come up. And sometimes people want readings like inspirational poems or meaningful poems. Sometimes those are written on memory cards. Those are possibilities too. And again, some people think only scripture readings can be read. That's not the case. There can be other inspirational readings or poems read as well. Christ Lutheran Church, you can have a photo tribute or not. And then since we've been live streaming before the service is a great place to do it. Before that, we used to do it during the service, usually after the eulogy, because once we've heard about the loved one, it's nice to see those memories of the loved one, which is why we choose to have it there. And also number 6 on this handout, funerals with forethought. You can think about special rituals you might like, which I talked about earlier, laying flowers at the service in the church, or laying flowers at the graveside, or carrying the urn to the graveside, or dressing Hawaiian, or wearing your loved one's favorite color. There's so many Riders fans in Regina. Maybe if you want people to wear green, who knows? So this handout is for you folks to consider what you might want for your service. And then you can always return it to the church, and we will put it in a safe spot in our vault so that your wishes are honored. And another tip is that you don't necessarily need to have the funeral home at the church. With the casket, you would, because you need that casket transported. But if it's just an urn, the family can transport the urn. And I think the cost is about $500, give or take, having the funeral home at the church. So I'm just mentioning this as another tip to save money. It's not necessary. especially if the family is setting up the memory table. Myself or Pastor Dennis can make sure the family walks in and is seated appropriately. Guest, if you want to, the guest book can be set up. You don't necessarily have to have a funeral home employee standing there asking people to sign the guest book. So that's not required, and more families are going with not having a funeral home present in the church because in many cases it's just not a necessary expense. All right, so the other thing I wanted to mention is that what I learned in my end of life doula class is, like, I used to, and Brenda's taken it too. Brenda Brown is from New Hope Lutheran Church. I used to think that it was illegal to scatter ashes, but it actually isn't. Like on Crown land, you can scatter ashes, obviously, and if it's your private property, you can do what you want. It's only if you want the ashes scattered on someone else's private property, then you need permission. Does that sound right, Brenda? Right. Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. So there is some freedom to scatter ashes, but if it's land owned by someone or City of Regina, then you would need to get permission. But if it's what I read was if it's Crown land, it's okay to do that. So number 14, cremation or casket. So I just wanted to mention that there is a water cremation that is available in Swift Current. It's called alkaline hydrolysis. And then I have a website if you'd like to look at that. So it's an option for folks who might be interested in cremation, but maybe don't like the idea of the intense heat of cremation. And I'm not going to go into the science behind it because I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but just to know that that is an option. And then number 15 mentions burial or scattering. So again, knowing that those are options. And I wanted to mention that there's also green burial available in the province. It's near Saskatoon. And I have a website that leads you to that information. And I found that through the Alternatives Funeral Home. And I think their website said they're one of 10 funeral homes in the country that offer green burial. So that's near. It is, I'm afraid that I might, maybe later, or you can look at the website. Yeah, I'm afraid if I look that up on my, or can you say something off the top of your head, Brenda, about green burial? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Like I know it's with the body, green burial, the body is buried, but I know it's not a casket. Yeah, like a shroud or a wicker basket. So the person is put in a shroud or a wicker basket, and then they're placed lower. No. Yeah, it still has to go on the ground, but it's not as low. It's not as deep. Okay. Right. Yes. Right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, just so you know, a green burial is available in Saskatchewan. So It's 11:04. Maybe if we can maybe spend 5 or 10 minutes doing questions and answers, because I've been talking quite a lot here. Just
the bank, and we used to have a notice kind of thing in the paper to go by. It used to be locked one time. Is it still locked and you have to put a notice in the paper? Okay, no. So you see that shit from head, so we just figured it out. What's your choice? I need the death certificate.
Okay, so the question was, do you still need to put a death notice in the paper? And from people in the know, the answer was no. You're not legally required to put a death notice in the paper. Oh, I see Rose has a question.
Yes, how, like after the body is burned, how big are the ashes? Like I'm looking at my jewelry box. Would it fit in my jewelry box? Say about a 4-inch jewelry box. Yeah. Would you have an average for a body?
There's probably information out there. I can't tell you off the top of my head. What, like, the ashes are delivered to you in a bag. Sorry, I believe it's in a plastic bag. And if you don't choose an urn, you'll get a velvet bag. So plastic bag with the ashes in a velvet bag, I believe. And then, so in a case like that, if there was something you wanted to be buried in, if there was too much ash to go in that receptacle, you could do something else with those ashes.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. So Brenda said her mom's wish was to be buried in an Edwards coffee can. And then when I asked my sister for extra, like some of my dad's ashes to scatter around the tree we planted, she had them in a Parmesan cheese container. So I guess they could be sprinkled. So anyway, just so you know that there's some wacky options out there. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, somebody said I think you would need there, if you're choosing your own thing to be buried in, there is probably a certain size restriction. And right, okay. Yeah. Yeah, so Brenda was saying, yeah, and that information might be available, like a quick call to Riverside or to a funeral home or something, but. Okay. Okay, so Bruce was sharing that a loved one was, Bruce McCaskill was sharing that a loved one was buried in a birdhouse that she made or was made for her. Okay, that her granddaughter made. So.
Decided all the time. And when the arrow went over, the bell went over to the birdhouse Casket and back down, put his paws together like that.
Oh, so Bruce is just saying that the family dog was at that graveside service and put his paws on the birdhouse before it was. Yeah. Yep. So any other questions? All right, and I'm always available via, via, oh, okay. Oh, okay. So Brenda Brown just gave me a little note here. So there's resource planning guide binders available. So one example is called Just in Case binder. There's tabs and helpful checklists, and you can add your own details and papers. And it also includes financial and internet footprint. So what that means is like Facebook page, password, right? Oh, right. So, wow. And that's something that we don't always think of. And then Brenda has an example of a binder to loan or simply look up. And when I send out this information electronically, I'll make sure that there's, okay, people in Saskatoon. Okay, so then I'll make sure that there's information. So this will make things so much easier for your loved ones. All right, so it's 11 after 11. So I think that I'm just going to end with a word of prayer. So thank you very much for joining us via Zoom and in person. And I'm always available for further questions, like through email or phone or whatever. So, all right, let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for your presence in us, through us, and among us this morning. It can be difficult to think about our death, to think about have these conversations with our loved ones, but we know that as people of faith, that we no longer need to fear death, but know that there is a new life waiting for us with you as we rejoin our loved ones at the end of our life. And we also know that there is no point that we are ever alone in this life or the next. We rejoice that we are your children and that you are present with us always, and that you hold us and our loved ones who are still living and who have passed away in your loving arms. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. All right. See you again sometime.